Charleston was founded early April of 1670 by the Englishmen. When the Englishmen came here, they brought with them their slaves and their servants. Most Africans came from West Africa, especially Sierra Leone. There's a great connection today with Charleston and Sierra Leone. Some of the same customs here are in Sierra Leone. Some of the same songs that are sung at funerals here are in Sierra Leone. On board the very first vessel of Englishmen, the vessel was called the Carolina. Of 93 passengers, 1 black was on board, and we believe that black came from West Africa. The second vessel was called the Three Brothers. 3 blacks were on board this vessel, and this was the first record of blacks by name into this city. This also constituted the first black family. The names were Elizabeth, John Jr., and John Sr. They were the slaves and servants to Captain Sally. They came from Barbados. Most black families on the Sea Islands around Charleston are able to trace their roots back to the West Indies, especially Barbados. The tract of land known today as Charlestown Landing, which is located 4 miles west of here on the Ashley River, was the site of the first town. The Englishmen moved the town on this peninsula in 1680. Basically so that they would have better protection from their enemies, who were the various Indian tribes, Spaniards, and later on the pirates. So the city then was a walled city from 1704 to 1720. Slaves built the wall from old Charleston brick and logs from the palmetto trees. The wall was torn down because the city was expanding in the 1720s. The Stoner Rebellion took place in 1739. The King of Spain said he would accept any slave as a free person if he or she could make it to Florida. 12 miles west of Charleston, in the community of Rangtals, stood Hutchinson's store. Some of the slaves from the Stoner River plantations went into the store one Sunday morning that year, overpowered the white store clerks, killed them, beheaded them, and left their heads on the steps of the store. They started marching south toward Florida. Many of the plantations those slaves came in contact with, they killed the white slave owners and their families, and those blacks on the plantations joined them. Lieutenant Governor William Bull was on his way to Charleston home on horseback. He came in the vicinity of these men. By late afternoon, he had gathered up a posse of white men and went after them. Many of these slaves were captured and killed right on the spot. Some escaped and made it to Florida. This was the Stoner Rebellion, 1739. The Second Presbyterian Church, built 1809. Denmark Vesey, who started a slave uprising here in 1822, was a member of this church first. This was one of the white churches in Charleston that had a large black membership before the Civil War, over 200 black members. Later, Denmark Vesey preached to this church's congregation, Emmanuel AME Church, the oldest black congregation in Charleston, dating back to 1818. Denmark Vesey originally came here as a slave, purchased his freedom from some money he won in a lottery. Because he was unable to buy his family freedom, he started this plot, a conspiracy, in which 7,000 to 9,000 slaves knew about it from within a 50-mile radius of Charleston. The plot was not successful. 3 blacks blew the whistle by telling on him. 2 slaves, 1 free black. 131 persons were then arrested, tried, and 35 were hanged. It was testified during the trial that if the plot would have gone over, this entire city would have been burned to the ground, all the banks robbed, all the white men killed, all the white women ravished, all of the blacks killed who would not go along with the plot, and all of the boats were to be used to transport the insurrectionists to the Dominican Republic. The original Emmanuel Church was immediately burned by a group of white citizens. This is the 1891 structure. It still has in it the original pews, floor, gas lamps, and pulpit. The pipe organ installed in 1908, it still plays every Sunday. The Reverend L.R. Nichols, who built this structure, he and his wife are buried on the inside of the church, just below the steeple. The church was founded in 1818 by the Reverend Morris Brown. That is the same Reverend Morris Brown who was the founder of the AME Church in this state. Morris Brown College in Atlanta, Georgia is named for him, and Morris Brown AME Church in Charleston. The church was closed by state law in 1834, reopened by the Reverend R. H. Kane in 1865. After it was discovered that Denmark Vesey used the church to have his meetings, all black churches, including Emmanuel, were closed for 31 years. The church was the only place blacks could gather in large numbers and whites not be suspicious. During this period of closing, blacks worshipped in the balconies and galleries of white churches, and many met very secretly. And when Emmanuel reopened after the Civil War, she had over 3,000 active members. This was the home of Denmark Vesey on Bull Street. He was arrested down the street at 2 Bull Street at the home of one of his 8 wives. The Miles Bruton House, built 1765, the spike ironwork was added after the Denmark Vesey slave plot in 1822. Whites were afraid they would be attacked by blacks. Another result of the Denmark Vesey slave uprising was the founding of the Citadel, the Military College of South Carolina, in 1842. A state arsenal was originally established at Marion Square to protect the city. During this period, blacks outnumbered whites at least 4-1. The 2 slaves who told on Denmark Vesey received as a reward their freedom and $50 a year. Many slaves received their freedom by doing good deeds. Another example of a good deed. The black boatman of St. Philip's Episcopal Church in 1796 won his freedom by putting out the burning shingles from the roof of the original church. Many Charlestonians believe in ghosts. It is still said that the black boatman's ghost can be seen roaming in St. Philip's churchyard. Few, if any, blacks live today in the Church Street or below Broad Street neighborhoods. It's mainly because of economics. These were mixed neighborhoods until the early 1970s. The majority of the blacks lived in the alleys, the lanes, and the courts. If old buildings could talk, what stories would be told? The old jail, built 1802, last used as a jail 1939. Many blacks, whites, and pirates were imprisoned in the old jail before they were hanged. Denmark Vesey was in prison here before he was hanged, accused of encouraging this plot in 1822. During the Civil War, many federal prisoners of war were imprisoned here. Also, after the Denmark Vesey slave uprising, black seamen were required to stay in the old jail before returning to sea. Down the street from the old jail on Magazine Street once stood the site of the workhouse or the whipping house, a place where blacks were sent for strict punishment for doing bad deeds such as arson and food poisoning. The workhouse was also a place where runaway slaves and apprentices were held for 60 days. If they were not claimed by their owners, they were sold, and the money used to pay for the room and board. It was also a place of execution. In 1739, Dolly and Liverpool, two slaves, husband and wife, were burned to death alive in the yard of the workhouse for poisoning an infant white child. Market Street. Many refer to it as the old slave market, but this is not where blacks were auctioned off and sold. When the families of Charles Pinckney and Charles Cosworth Pinckney gave this land to the city, it was stipulated that this area should always remain a city market and that blacks should never be sold here. And if those ordinances were broken, the land would have to go back to the descendants of the Pinckney families. The public market building. The symbols above the columns are symbols of ram's heads, bull skulls, or sheep skulls, placed there to let the illiterates know that this was a public beef market. All of the livestock were slaughtered here by blacks who worked as butchers. At the end of each day, the unused meat were thrown into Meeting Street for the Charleston Eagles or the Buzzards. They were protected by law to keep the streets clean. The old Exchange and Provost Dungeon building is the last building in Charleston built by the British. It had many uses. It was once used as the customs house, the post office, the basement used as a dungeon. Slaves were sold at the old Exchange until 1852. That year, the city passed an ordinance prohibiting the auctioning of slaves on public streets. This practice was then taken around the corner at 6 Chalmers Street at the old Slave Mart Museum building. Blacks were put on platforms behind the building. Some called them chopping blocks. They were auctioned off, sold, chained, held on the inside until their owners took them away. This is the only Afro-American museum of its kind left today in the United States. The slave quarters behind the Aiken-Rhett House is a perfect example of urban slavery in the 17 and 1800s. The slave quarters behind the house, slaves mainly lived on the second floor. The bottom floor is where the carriages were kept and the kitchens. The smaller house behind the slave quarters was once used as the chicken coop and cow shed. The building behind the chicken coop and cow shed was the privy building or the outhouse. Suburbs like this one, Ragsboro and Mosaicsboro, were first located outside of the city limits until 1850. Charleston went as far as Calhoun Streets, which was first called Boundary Street until 1850. So those persons who owned land outside of the old walled city suburbs were named after them. Charleston had a large free black population before the Civil War. It was second to New Orleans. Mobile, Alabama, Savannah, Georgia, and Richmond, Virginia followed Charleston. In 1790, Charleston had 8,000 whites, 7,600 slaves, 586 free blacks. In the 1840s, over 1,500 free blacks. 180 of them were black slave masters, blacks owning their own slaves. Many of those free blacks moved on Charleston's east side in the early 1800s, suburbs known today as Mosaicsboro and Ragsboro. Next to St. Michael's Church in the early 1800s stood Jehu Jones's Hotel. Jones was a prominent free black whose hotel catered only to influential whites. Jones was the first black ordained Lutheran minister in this state. In 1826, his son Edward was one of the first black college graduates in the United States. Just down the street, 58 Broad Street, was the site of the Freedmen's Bank, the first bank established for blacks in Charleston in 1867. Centenary United Methodist Church, founded 1865. Many of its original members were members of the Brown Fellowship Society, a benevolent organization of light-skinned black men or brown black men organized in 1790. The first 9 pastors of Centenary United Methodist Church were white men. These blacks did not feel comfortable having black ministers yelling and screaming at them. They were comfortable with white ministers lecturing to them. They did not believe in all this emotionalism. Many members of the Brown Fellowship Society lived in Halston Village. So did many members of the Humane Brotherhood Society, a benevolent organization of dark-skinned free black men. In fact, both groups had its burial ground and society hall next door to each other, separated by a fence. 94 Smith Street, built about 1820, was built by the Reverend Morris Brown as rental property. Reverend Morris Brown was the founder of the AME Church in Charleston and in South Carolina. The house next door, 96 Smith Street, was owned by Richard Holloway, the most prominent free black in Charleston in the 1800s. He was a black slave master, a member of the Brown Fellowship Society. He owned over 20 houses in the city. Later, in 1896, another prominent black family, the Halston brothers, established Halston's Funeral Home, known today as Halston Bugs. 67 Alexander Street was built in 1838 by Richard Edward DeReef, the wealthiest free black man in Charleston in the 1800s. This is the only house in Charleston still standing that he built, and he built it as rental property. The tower here belongs to these depot buildings, part of the first locomotive railroad to carry passengers and freight, known as the best friend of Charleston. For many years, this railroad, which dates back to 1830, was the longest railroad in the world. It went 130 miles from Charleston, South Carolina, to Hamburg, known today as North Augusta, and many of the assistant engineers to the railroad were black men. This Federal-style home, built 1789, was the home of Sarah and Angelina Grumke, abolitionists who left Charleston in the 1830s, moved to Boston and Philadelphia to continue with the abolitionist movement. 1672, the first slave ship arrived in Charleston. It arrived on Sullivan's Island. That island then became somewhat of an Ellis Island for blacks. Refugee camps and pest houses were set up on that island. It even became a quarantine station, not only for blacks, but for European immigrants too. More Africans came to the state of South Carolina as slaves than any other state in the country. Most of those blacks touched soil on Sullivan's Island. Most of the old homes and buildings in Charleston were built from falchions made from rice. For over 140 years, over one half of Charleston's income was generated from rice. Charleston is the first city in the United States where rice was first planted and cultivated, planted by the blacks in 1694 who came from Madagascar. Rice, indigo, and cotton were some of the main crops grown on the plantations in the Charleston area. Because of the demand for slave labor, Charleston was the richest city in the United States for 90 years. from the 1730s to the 1820s, known as the Golden Years of Commerce. During this period, hundreds of ships overcrowded the Charleston harbor. Most of these vessels were worked by slaves at Adger's Wharf. Today, most of the men who work on the waterfront are black men. There were many causes of the Civil War. One cause was because of slavery. The Civil War was started in Charleston. The first shots were fired from Fort Johnson to Fort Sumter. Most blacks knew that once the Civil War started, they were on their way to being free. Robert Smalls, a slave from Beaufort, became a hero in the harbor during the Civil War. He stole the Confederate ship the Planter. He put on the white sea captain's clothing, disguising himself as such, and sailed that Confederate ship into Union waters and joined the Union Army. During the Reconstruction period, Robert Smalls became the first black representative in the South Carolina State House and later a U.S. Senator. Across the harbor on James Island, numerous soldiers of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment fought and died. This was the first black regiment established during the Civil War. The 54th was stationed at Battery Wagner on nearby Mars Island. The Boys and Girls Club on Charleston's east side is enjoyed by the children in the neighborhood. The word show unit comes from Robert Gould Shaw, the white colonel who was over the 54th Regiment, in which the movie Glory was about. Avery Normal Institute, founded in 1865 as Charleston's first secondary school for blacks. Avery remained a private institution until 1947, when it became Avery High School. It closed its doors in 1954 and merged with Burke High School. Today, Avery is a research center and museum for African American history and culture. Old Bethel United Methodist Church, built 1797, was rolled to this present location on logs from the palmetto trees from across the street. The white congregation of Bethel gave this church to its black members. New Tabernacle Fourth Baptist Church. The congregation was founded by the Reverend Daniel J. Jenkins. Reverend Jenkins founded Jenkins Orphanage in 1891. The orphanage is still in existence today, located in North Charleston. It was the black children in the Jenkins Orphanage Band who started the famous dance, the Charleston. The old Marine Hospital building was the home of Jenkins Orphanage from 1895 until 1939. In 1867, it became a school for black children that 15 white women had established. Today, it is owned by the Housing Authority of the City of Charleston. 118 Broad Street, the John Rutledge Inn, built in the 1760s. It is said that William Dees, a black man, invented she crab soup here, a Charleston specialty, in 1909. Catfish Row. This is where that famous black opera Porgy and Bess was born. From 1900 to the 1930s, most of the black men who lived here were fishermen, the black women domestic workers. Originally, this was called Cabbage Row. The black women would plant the cabbages in the courtyard. Once they were fully grown, they would put them in the windows for sale. DuBose Hayward, a white gentleman who lived down the street, wrote a story about Sammy Smalls. He called him Porgy. George Gershwin of New York read the story, came to Charleston to study the culture of blacks, and came up with the famous opera Porgy and Bess. In the opera Porgy and Bess, there were many street vendors, just like they were at Catfish Row during this period. The Honey Man, the Crab Man, and the Strawberry Woman were some of the street vendors in the area. The Honey Man would come through selling his honey. Honey Man, here come the Honey Man, here come the Honey Man. I got honey in the comb, Yes, I got honey in the comb. And is my honey sweet? Yes, ma'am, my honey very sweet. And is my honey cheap? Yes, ma'am, my honey very cheap. Here come the honey man, the strawberry lady. They're so sweet and fine. And there's just off the vine strawberry, 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 strawberry. The crab man. I'm talking about the food I sell. I'm talking about the food I sell. She crab, she crab. I'm talking about your pocketbook. I'm talking about your pocketbook. She crab, she crab. 85 Calhoun Street for many years was nothing but a whorehouse for low-income blacks. The building was built in 1852. It was last used as the Visitors Information Center building. Mr. Philip Simmons, 83 years of age, is semi-retired as a blacksmith. This black gentleman has trained a nephew and a cousin this type of trade. Some of his ironwork is displayed in Washington in the Smithsonian Institute and in the State Museum. This is Mr. Philip Simmons' garden, located on the corner of George and Anson Streets. The West Side community here was all farmland in the late 1700s, early 1800s. Once stood in the vicinity here was a tree known as the hanging tree, where many were hanged. The original tree was cut down in the 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement and because of age. Charlestonians are called Geechees, basically for three reasons. Number one, because of rice. Lots of rice is eaten here, especially in the black community. The average black family will eat rice at least twice a day. A favorite dish is red rice. A favorite soup, okra soup, dessert, bread pudding. Secondly, Charlestonians are called Geechees because of the language Gullah. Gullah was a combination of broken English and whatever your native dialect was. And lastly, Charlestonians are called Geechees because of the culture of the people. An example, the sweetgrass basket makers. This is a 300-year-old craft that originated from Africa and the West Indies. This is the only area in the United States where this type of artwork is performed. Thank you for joining me on this tour. I'm Al Miller, licensed tour guide and president of Sights and Insight Tours. If you would like to join us, please write Sights and Insight Tours, Post Office Box 21346, Charleston, South Carolina 29413, or call area code 803-762-0051. I'd like to leave you with a sample of the Charleston clap. This is a three-fold clap that originated from Africa and the West Indies. Locally, the clap originated from the Sea Islands around Charleston. We believe that when the black women would sing the Negro spirituals, perhaps they felt the spirit and speeded up the tempo in the middle of the verse. We are climbing Jacob's ladder. We are climbing Jacob's ladder. Oh, we are climbing Jacob's ladder. Soldier
Him? Why not serve Him? Oh, if you love Him, why not serve